In the bustling heart of ancient Capernaum, where the sun blazed upon dusty roads and merchants called out from crowded stalls, there sat a man whose name was spoken with disdain. His hands counted silver, but his heart was weighed in gold that could not be measured, the currency of the soul. He was Matthew, son of Alphaeus, a tax collector for the empire, servant of Caesar's law but stranger to the law of God. He was a man who had mastered the art of survival in a world where loyalty was sold and mercy was a coin few could afford. To the Romans, he was useful. To his own people, he was a traitor. Yet, beneath the cold precision of his ledgers and the clinking of denarii, there was a question that haunted him in the silence of night. Is there more to life than this? Then, one day, a voice called his name, not in judgment, but in invitation. A voice that spoke with the weight of eternity, yet with the gentleness of a shepherd's hand. That voice belonged to a carpenter from Nazareth, a man whose eyes could see not the tax booth, nor the coins, but the eternal destiny buried deep within Matthew's soul. What began as a single moment, the leaving of a table, the stepping away from a life of gain, became an odyssey of transformation. From the shadows of corruption to the radiant halls of truth, from the shame of betrayal to the glory of proclaiming the gospel, Matthew's journey would become a living testament that no heart is too hardened, no past too stained, for the grace of the Messiah to redeem. This is not merely the story of man. It is the clash of two kingdoms, the empire of greed and the kingdom of heaven. It is the tale of a collector of coins who became a collector of souls. And it all began with a dinner and an unthinkable invitation. Chapter 1. The Man at the Tax Booth. The midday sun hung mercilessly over Capernaum, turning the stones of the marketplace into a shimmering haze. Merchants cried out their prices over the clamor of haggling voices. Children darted through the crowd with the swiftness of sparrows, and fishermen fresh from the Sea of Galilee hauled their glistening catches toward the stalls. Amid the dust and the scent of salt water, there was a table, low, sturdy, and immovable, and behind it sat the man who owned the gaze of every passerby, though few dared meet his eyes. Matthew, son of Alphaeus. His fingers moved with unyielding precision, tallying figures on parchment, stacking silver denarii into neat columns. Each coin caught the sunlight in a flash before vanishing into the iron-bound chest at his side. To the Romans, he was efficient, a man who could be trusted to collect their due. To his own people, he was a symbol of betrayal, the embodiment of greed dressed in fine linen. They called him Mokes, the tax collector, the one who took from his neighbors to feed the empire that crushed them. Yet Matthew was no fool. He knew their glares, their muttered curses, the way mothers pulled their children closer when they passed his booth. He knew the sting of being a man without a people, caught between the iron hand of Rome and the silent contempt of Israel. But he had learned to live with it. Silver was his fortress. Gold was his shield. Numbers were his only friends. Numbers that never judged him, never betrayed him, never lied. From his seat, Matthew could see everything. The bent back of the fisherman who struggled to pay his toll, the tired merchant whose profits shrank under the weight of Caesar's tax, the nobleman who slipped a bribe to avoid a full payment. He kept their names, their debts, their weaknesses all neatly in his mind. It was power, not the kind sung about by kings and warriors, but the quiet, suffocating power that could crush a man's dignity without lifting a sword. Yet sometimes, when the day grew long and the crowd thinned, he would pause. His pen would hover above the parchment, his hand still, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the Galilean hills faded into the blue. There was an emptiness in that view, and an emptiness in him, though he never spoke of it. What would he even say? That the weight of his wealth felt heavier than the curses of the poor? That each coin he counted seemed to echo in his chest like a hollow bell? It was on such a day that Matthew heard the whispers, not the usual marketplace gossip, no tales of politics or prices, but a name carried on the wind like the scent of rain before a storm. Yeshua, the rabbi who healed the sick, who spoke of a kingdom not built by Roman hands, whose words cut through the air like a blade and yet soothed like a balm. Some said he was a prophet, others the promised Messiah. Many scoffed, but all were curious. Matthew listened without looking up from his coins. He told himself it was nothing. Another holy man, another voice soon to fade into silence. And yet, the name stayed with him, like a coin slipped into his pocket unnoticed. The marketplace continued its restless rhythm, the shouts, the bargaining, the clash of commerce. But something in Matthew's world had shifted, though he could not yet name it. And so, beneath the blazing sun, with the weight of Rome on his shoulders and the weight of his own soul pressing heavier still, Matthew counted his silver, unaware that the next set of footsteps approaching his booth would shatter the life he had built and call him into a journey that would strip him of everything he thought he was and give him everything he had never dared to hope for. Chapter 2, Silver Chains. The coins sang their song again that night. They tumbled from his hands into the open chest, striking one another in a metallic cascade, bright, sharp, and hollow. By lamplight, the silver gleamed like a captive moon, each coin a silent witness to the choices that had bound Matthew's life. He sat alone in the upper room of his house, a place far larger than most in Capernaum, with walls painted in imported dyes and shelves lined with fine pottery from far-off lands. The air smelled faintly of spiced wine. It should have been enough. The taxes collected that day had been good. A shipment of fish from the sea's morning catch, a caravan of merchants passing through from Damascus, even a wealthy Sadducee paying a discreet adjustment to avoid imperial scrutiny, all of it swelling the purse at Matthew's belt. He was richer now than he had ever dreamed as a boy. Yet, as he leaned back in his cushioned chair, the weight on his chest was heavier than the weight of gold in his storeroom. Wealth had promised freedom, but instead it had forged chains, not of iron, but of silver, invisible to the eye, but no less binding. He could feel them the way he moved through the streets, every step shadowed by unspoken accusations. No one looked him in the eyes except to bargain or beg. Friends were business partners. Companions were fellow opportunists. Every smile was calculated, every kindness bought. And then there was the shame, unspoken, but never absent. When he passed the synagogue, he did not enter. The prayers of the righteous were not meant for him, nor for men like him. When the poor lined the roadside, their eyes slid away from his, as if the very sight of him was another tax to pay. His family's visits had grown rare, and conversations had shrunk to short, strained exchanges. Sometimes, in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, Matthew would find himself staring at the polished cups on his table or the ornate rug beneath his feet, and wonder, how many lives did I sell to own these? How many souls did I wound so that mine might rest on silk? But the world rewarded his kind. The Romans praised his efficiency. His ledger was spotless. His payments arrived on time. And for this, they granted him safety, the protection of the eagle's shadow. Still, safety was not the same as peace. That night, a storm began to rise over the Sea of Galilee, its distant thunder rolling into the city. Rain splattered against his windows, tapping like a restless messenger. Matthew poured himself another cup of wine, but the taste felt dull. He thought of the stories whispered in the marketplace. The rabbi from Nazareth, Yeshua, who spoke of treasures that could not rust or fade, of a kingdom where the last would be first and the broken would be made whole. The words gnawed at him like a hunger. He told himself he had no need for such dreams. He was a man of numbers, of facts, of transactions. But there was a longing in him that neither silver nor silence could drown. A longing to be more than the sum of his accounts. As the wind howled outside, Matthew's gaze fell to the open chest of coins at his feet. The silver glimmered, each piece a link in the unseen chain wrapped tight around his soul. And somewhere in the depths of his heart, he began to wonder, not yet with hope, but with the faintest spark of curiosity, whether someone might hold the key to break them. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Marketplace. Morning came with the scent of fresh bread and the murmur of voices carried on the salt-kissed wind. The marketplace was awakening. Stalls creaked open. Bolts of colored cloth were unfurled. Baskets of figs and dates were stacked in neat pyramids, and the shouts of fishermen echoed from the shore as they bargained for a fair price before the heat of the day. Matthew sat at his booth as he always did, quill in hand, ledger open, eyes scanning the crowd with the detached gaze of a hawk. Every movement was measured. He could tell who was trying to avoid his eyes, who was stalling for time, who was hiding a coin in their sleeve. It was the same as yesterday, the same as the day before, until he noticed the way people's conversations kept dropping to a murmur. It was like a ripple in water, moving through the market. People leaned closer to one another, heads bowed, voices low, and then the moment passed as the whisper traveled on. He caught fragments of words, drifting just loud enough for him to catch. He touched the leper, forgave the crippled man's sins. The demons obey him, even the sea and the wind. Matthew's cool paused mid-stroke. He heard the name again, Yeshua, the rabbi from Nazareth. The same name that had brushed past him days before, the one he'd tried to dismiss like a stray gust of wind. But now the whispers were sharper, fuller, alive with something dangerous. Hope. A spice merchant leaned in toward a fisherman, his voice trembling with excitement. They say he looked at a man who had been paralyzed since birth and told him to rise. And the man did. Just like that. No offering, no coin, no temple priest. Just walked away. The fisherman shook his head in disbelief, but there was a light in his eyes. I saw him calm a storm. We thought the boat would split, and he spoke, and the sea grew quiet. I've never seen anything like it. Matthew kept his gaze on his ledger, but his ears were fixed on every word. This was no passing curiosity anymore. The stories were multiplying too quickly, and unlike the boastful tales of traders, these whispers carried no embellishment, just an urgency, as though the people themselves weren't sure they believed what they had seen, but could not stop speaking of it. By midday, the air was thick with expectation. More than one customer at his table paid their tax distractedly, their eyes scanning the street as if they hoped to see this rabbi appear. One woman, a poor widow with little more than 2 copper coins, lingered at the booth longer than needed, clutching her payment. "Do you think it's true?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Matthew looked up, caught off guard. "Do I think what is true? That he eats with sinners," she said, almost whispering. "That he speaks to men like you, like me." Her words struck him in a place he did not expect. "Men like you." She meant his truth, not insult. He managed a faint smile, took her coins, and returned to his ledger without answering. But inside, the question echoed like a bell. By late afternoon, the marketplace began to thin, but the whispers did not fade. Somewhere beyond the crowds, beyond the noise of trade, this Yeshua was walking the roads of Galilee, leaving changed lives in his wake. Matthew dipped his quill into ink, forcing himself back into the comfort of numbers. Yet, as the ink touched parchment, his hand faltered. He did not know why, but he felt certain that the ripples moving through the marketplace would one day reach his booth, and when they did, nothing in his carefully ordered life would remain the same. Chapter 4. The Call. It was late morning when the heat began to press down on Capernaum like an invisible hand. The marketplace bustled with its usual chaos, the scent of grilled fish from a nearby vendor, the clatter of amphorae being unloaded from a donkey cart, the low hum of countless transactions weaving together into a single restless song. Matthew was at his booth, the same as every day, quills scratching across parchment, coins clinking in neat stacks. He noticed nothing unusual at first, just the flow of humanity passing before him like an endless river. Merchants, fishermen, soldiers, beggars. Then the river slowed. It was subtle, a pause in the crowd, a shift in the air, as though the wind itself had turned to watch something. Conversations dropped into murmurs, and faces angled toward the same point in the street. Matthew's eyes followed theirs. A small group was approaching, walking with no hurry, yet every step seemed to part the sea of people around them. At their center was a man, no robe of priestly white, no armor of a soldier, just the plain garments of a Galilean. But there was something in his presence, a gravity that seemed to draw the world inward. His face was calm, his stride unbroken, his eyes scanning the street as though he knew every soul who walked upon it. And then, without warning, Those eyes met Matthew's. The sound of the marketplace faded. The coins before him seemed suddenly dull, their silver sheen a pale imitation of the light in that man's gaze. It was not the look of a judge, nor of a customer, nor even of a stranger. It was the look of someone who saw everything, the betrayal, the greed, the loneliness, and did not turn away. The man stopped at Matthew's booth. The crowd watched in silence. No one spoke at first. Matthew's fingers froze on the quill. He felt the weight of the moment pressing in, as though the very air waited to hear what would be said. Then, in a voice steady as the sea at dawn, the man spoke 2 words. "Follow me." That was all. No rebuke, no lecture, no conditions, just an invitation, simple and impossible. Matthew's mind raced. He thought of his table, his accounts, the guarded chest at his side. He thought of the Romans who relied on him, the people who despised him, the security he had built coin by coin. To leave would be madness. And yet, there was something in that voice. A promise of freedom he could not name. A certainty that if he stood still, if he let this man walk away, he would lose more than all the silver in his possession. He would lose the very reason for his existence. Without a word, Matthew set down his quill. The ledger remained open, unfinished. The coins lay where they were, uncounted. He rose from the table, stepped out from behind it, and walked into the space beside the man from Nazareth. The crowd murmured, astonished. The rabbi smiled faintly, turned, and continued down the street. Matthew followed, leaving behind the booth, the silver, the chains that had bound him for years. And with each step, the clinking of coins faded, replaced by the sound of something new, the steady rhythm of a heart beginning to beat for a kingdom not of this world. Chapter 5. Leaving the table. The sound of his own footsteps felt strange, light, unchained, almost foreign, as Matthew walked away from the tax booth. The world behind him still hummed with the noise of bargaining and bartering, but it seemed distant now, like an echo from another life. For years, this table had been his fortress. From here, he had counted his wealth, measured his power, and built a life walled in by numbers and guarded by Rome's shadow. Every coin had been a stone in that fortress wall. Now, in a single moment, he had stepped beyond it. The air felt different. He could feel eyes on his back, some wide with disbelief, others narrowed in contempt. A few of the bystanders muttered to each other, unable to hide their scorn. Where does he think he's going? He'll be back before sunset. Traitor to us, traitor to Rome. He belongs nowhere. The Roman guard assigned to the marketplace watched him go with a frown, but made no move to stop him. After all, Rome could replace a tax collector easily enough. But among Matthew's own people, the shock was palpable. A man like him didn't just walk away from his post. Not without reason, not without fear. Yet Matthew felt neither reason nor fear, only a pull. A certainty that the man he now followed was worth more than all the silver locked in his chest. They walked a short distance through the crowded street. Matthew's mind was a storm of thoughts. He thought of the accounts left open, the bribes undone, the debts uncollected. He thought of the years spent building a name that everyone hated. He thought of the ledger, still sitting on the table, ink still wet, a symbol of a life now abandoned. When they paused at the edge of the market, Matthew looked back. There it was, his table, unattended. The coins still stacked in neat rows, the chest half open, the quill resting where he'd set it down. For a moment, he wondered if he should go back, just for a final count, one last lock of the chest. But he didn't move, because for the first time in years, the silver didn't call to him. Instead, he saw it for what it truly was, not treasure but chains. The rabbi, Yeshua, turned to him. There was no congratulation, no question, only a quiet look that seemed to say, "You will not need that table where we are going." And somehow, Matthew believed it. As they walked on, the murmurs of the crowd faded. In their place came a new sound, laughter from a group ahead, voices greeting Yeshua with warmth and wonder. Matthew recognized some of them. Fishermen from the docks, a man once crippled who now walked with steady steps, a woman once shunned, now speaking freely among the others. It struck him then that he was stepping into a different kind of company, Not the rich, not the powerful, but the broken, the healed, the hopeful. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he wondered if there might be a place for him among them. Behind him, the table remained, a silent monument to a life that no longer owned him. Ahead of him stretched a road he could not see the end of, led by a man who seemed to carry eternity in his every step. And Matthew followed. Chapter 6, A Banquet of Grace. The decision came quickly, almost recklessly, the kind of impulse that would have terrified the old Matthew, the man who weighed every choice like a merchant weighing gold. But the new Matthew, the one who had left his table behind, felt only urgency. He would host a feast, not a modest gathering, but a true banquet. The best wine, the richest meats, the freshest bread. A night that would mark the turning point of his life. A celebration of the one who had looked at him, spoken 2 words, and shattered his chains. The invitations were not written on parchment or carried by servants. Matthew went himself, speaking to those the rest of the city avoided. He found them in narrow alleys and dim taverns, at the edge of the marketplace and on the docks. Tax collectors like him, laborers who owed more than they could ever pay, women whose names were only spoken in whispers, men whose pasts were a weight too heavy to carry alone. Each one reacted the same way. Disbelief. "You want me at your table?" "Yes," Matthew replied simply. "Come and eat. The rabbi will be there." By evening, the house was alive with voices. Oil lamps cast a warm glow across the room, glinting off cups of deep red wine and platters piled high. Laughter and conversation filled the air, mingling with the aroma of roasted lamb and spiced figs. At the center of it all sat Yeshua. He was not there as a guest of honor in the manner of kings, demanding attention or ceremony. Instead, he spoke with each person as if they were the only one in the room, listening to their stories, their fears, their hopes. His hands broke bread and passed it freely. His eyes carried the same quiet power that had called Matthew from the booth. It was then that the shadow fell. At the doorway, a group of Pharisees stood, their robes pristine, their expressions hard. They did not enter. They observed, whispering among themselves with the kind of disdain that needed no words. Finally, one of them called out to the disciples who stood near the edge of the feast, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" The question cut through the laughter, drawing every ear toward the rabbi. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then Yeshua looked toward them, his face calm, but his voice carrying like the toll of a bell. "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." The words settled over the room like a fresh wind. Some lowered their heads, tears in their eyes. Others felt the weight of guilt lift like a stone rolled away. Matthew, standing at the far end of the table, felt something deep within him shift. He realized this was more than a feast. It was a picture of the kingdom itself, the unwanted brought near, the shamed restored, the outcast given a seat of honor. And he knew, without doubt, that he would never again serve another master. The Pharisees turned away into the night, but the feast continued, richer now not in food or drink, but in the taste of grace, a banquet that no hunger of the world could match. Chapter 7, The Clash of Kingdoms. The banquet had ended, but its echoes had not faded. The laughter, the clink of cups, the words of the rabbi, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners," still rang in Matthew's mind like the sound of a bell long after it has been struck. But for others, the feast had left a different kind of echo, offense. By morning, the streets of Capernaum carried the murmurs of discontent. Pharisees and scribes walked in tight clusters, their voices low but sharp. Some spoke of dangerous leniency, others of blasphemous disregard for the law. The word Messiah was whispered with a tone not of hope, but of suspicion. Matthew walked with Yeshua and the others through the market, and he could feel the eyes upon them, some curious, some warm, many hostile. The Pharisees had begun to follow at a distance, questioning, testing, looking for fault. It happened first near the synagogue. A group of Pharisees stepped forward, their robes brushing the dust, their faces set like stone. "Why?" one of them demanded. Do your disciples break the traditions of our elders? The air around them tightened. Matthew's old instinct stirred, the familiar sensation of being judged, measured, condemned, but Yeshua stood unshaken. Well, do you nullify the command of God for the sake of your tradition? He answered, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on them. You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. The crowd that had gathered gasped at the boldness of his words. The Pharisees stiffened, but Yeshua turned away, as if the argument were already settled. As they walked on, Matthew realized he was witnessing something far larger than a quarrel between men. This was the collision of two kingdoms, one built on walls of law and ritual, guarded by gatekeepers who decided who could come near, the other open like a sunrise over the hills, inviting the broken, the unworthy, the despised. The tension followed them into every village. Questions became challenges. Challenges became open accusations. By what authority do you do these things? Who gave you this power? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Each time, Yeshua's answers carried the same quiet authority, words that did not seek to win an argument, but to reveal a truth. And each time, Matthew felt both awe and warning. This path would not lead to peace with the powers of his world, not with Rome, not with the Pharisees, not with anyone who feared losing control. Late one afternoon, as they sat beside the road outside the city, Matthew found himself staring at the dust swirling in the wind. The rabbi was speaking to the others about the kingdom of heaven, how it was like a seed hidden in the soil, like yeast working unseen in the dough. And Matthew understood. This kingdom was already here, but it was not welcomed by all. It would be opposed. It would be hated, and those who walked in it would be marked. Yet as he listened, he felt no desire to turn back. For in Yeshua's voice, he heard not only the promise of conflict, but the certainty of victory. Two kingdoms had met, and only one would remain. Chapter 8, Learning the Way. The days that followed were unlike any Matthew had known. His old life had been a rigid pattern. Dawn at the booth, the steady flow of transactions, the clink of coins, the guarded walk home. But life with the rabbi had no fixed shape. Some mornings began in the stillness of prayer before the sun touched the Galilean hills. Others began on the road, their sandals stirring the dust as they traveled from village to village. Matthew quickly learned that to follow Yeshua was to live without the illusion of control. They never knew what the day would bring. A crowd pressing in for healing, a Pharisee with a question like a trap, a family offering bread and shelter, or the sudden, quiet moment when Yeshua would stop in the middle of the road to speak a single sentence that somehow felt like it was spoken directly into your soul. At first, Matthew listened more than he spoke. He studied the others, Simon Peter with his quick tongue and quicker temper, Andrew with his quiet faith, James and John whose zeal burned like the noonday sun. They were fishermen, craftsmen, zealots, men who had nothing in common with a former tax collector except the fact that the rabbi had called them. Not all welcomed him warmly at first. Matthew caught the occasional sidelong glance, the unspoken reminder of who he had been. But slowly those looks softened. Trust grew not through argument, but through shared hunger, shared road, shared wonder at what they were seeing. And what they saw defied reason. A man with a withered hand, restored before their eyes. A blind beggar, crying out in the dark, suddenly lifting his face to the light. Crowds fed from a few loaves and fish until their laughter rolled like waves over the hills. Each miracle struck Matthew differently. The others marveled at the power, but Matthew saw something else, the intentionality. Yeshua never healed at random. He looked into a person as though reading the hidden story of their life, then spoke or touched in the exact way that would break the chain no one else could see. In those moments, Matthew thought of his own chains, the ones broken when he had left his table. He began to understand that this was the way, not just rules or rituals, but the restoration of what had been lost, the reclaiming of what had been stolen by sin and despair. The rabbi's teachings deepened the lesson. The kingdom of heaven was like a treasure hidden in a field, Yeshua said, worth selling everything to possess. Like a pearl, so rare a merchant would trade all he had to own it. Matthew understood these parables with a pang. He had once traded people's livelihoods for coins. Now he saw a treasure beyond price, one he would give up all else to keep. Yet the way was not without cost. They were often weary, sometimes hungry, sometimes jeered at or pushed aside. And though Matthew felt freer than ever, he also sensed the growing opposition, the tightening net of those who saw Yeshua as a threat. One evening, as they rested near the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Yeshua spoke quietly to the group. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Matthew's heart tightened at the words. He had left his table, yes, but the path ahead would demand far more. Still, as he looked at the face of the one who had called him, he knew there was no turning back. For he was no longer merely learning the way. The way was remaking him. Chapter 9. Storms and Signs. The sea was restless that day, a mirror of the turmoil stirring within Matthew's heart. The sky, once clear and calm, darkened suddenly as heavy clouds rolled over the Galilean hills. The wind whispered warnings through the olive trees, and the air grew thick with the scent of coming rain. They had set out in a small boat after a day spent teaching crowds along the shore. The disciples were tired but satisfied. Even Matthew felt a rare peace settle over him as he watched the waves lap gently against the hull. But peace was short-lived. Without warning, the wind screamed to life, whipping the waters into frothing chaos. The boat rocked violently, pitching like a leaf caught in a storm. Disciples scrambled to hold the sails, shouting orders over the roar. Fear gripped Matthew like a vice. The sea, once a friend, now seemed an enemy bent on swallowing them whole. In the midst of the tempest, Yeshua lay asleep on a cushion, untouched by the fury around him. Panic surged among the men as the waves threatened to capsize their fragile vessel. "Rabbi, don't you care if we drown?" Peter shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Slowly, Yeshua rose, his calm an unyielding rock against the storm. He stood and raised his hand, speaking words that cut through the thunder. "Peace, be still." Immediately, the wind ceased, the waves stilled, and an unnatural silence fell over the sea. The boat floated as if on a glassy lake beneath the clearing sky. The disciples stared, wide-eyed and breathless. Even Matthew's chest tightened with awe. "Who is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" he whispered. That night, gathered around a fire, the rabbis shared stories of faith and the kingdom, how trust in God could calm storms far greater than any sea. Matthew listened, the memory of the storm still vivid in his mind, the lesson seeping deep into his soul. Days later came another sign, quieter but no less miraculous. Near a hillside, thousands had gathered, hungry and weary. The disciples worried. How could they feed so many with so little? Yeshua took 5 loaves and 2 fish from a boy, blessing them with a word, then began to distribute the food. One by one, the crowd ate until their hunger was satisfied, and still baskets of leftovers remained. Matthew watched amazed. The miracle was not just in the multiplication of bread, but in the abundance given when faith met need. Each sign, each storm, was a step deeper into a new reality. The old world of coins and contracts, of judgment and isolation, fell further behind. Matthew's journey was no longer about escape or survival. It was about trust, transformation, and a kingdom that demanded everything and promised everything in return. And he was ready to follow, no matter where the path would lead. Chapter 10. Betrayal and Blood. Darkness fell over Jerusalem like a suffocating cloak, smothering the city in shadows both real and unseen. The narrow streets, once filled with the murmurs of anticipation and hope, now whispered with secrets and fear. Matthew moved cautiously, his heart pounding as he sensed the growing storm. The weight of what was to come pressed upon him like an invisible chain, binding his soul with dread and disbelief. For weeks, the tension had been mounting. The authorities, uneasy with Yeshua's growing influence, watched from the sidelines. The Pharisees whispered among themselves, plotting to silence the one who challenged their power and threatened their control. But the most painful blow came not from enemies, but from within their own circle. Judas Iscariot, the man who had shared their meals and walked their dusty roads, carried in his hand a bag of silver, the price of treachery. Matthew's mind replayed the scene again and again. Judas slipping away into the night, the cold glint of coins exchanged in secret, the betrayal masked by shadows. How had it come to this? How could one so close become the instrument of ruin? The evening of the Last Supper was heavy with unspoken words. The room, lit by flickering lamps, held an air of finality. Yeshua spoke of his impending departure, his voice both tender and resolute. He broke the bread, shared the cup, and spoke of a new covenant sealed in blood. Matthew watched the faces around him, the sorrow, the confusion, the silent questions hanging like smoke in the air. Yet none guessed the full weight of what was about to unfold. Later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night seemed to hold its breath. Yeshua prayed alone, his sweat like drops of blood upon the earth. Then came the soldiers, led by Judas's kiss, a sign as bitter as the silver that had bought it. The arrest was swift and brutal. The peaceful rabbi became a prisoner, bound and taken away through the labyrinth of alleys and courts. Matthew's heart shattered with every step, each echo a hammer blow to his faith. And then the blood of innocence spilled unjustly, staining the stones and searing the memories of those who bore witness. But even in the darkest hour, a promise whispered through the silence, that beyond betrayal and death, a greater victory awaited. Matthew knew the path ahead would be filled with sorrow, but also with hope born anew. The story of redemption was far from over. Chapter 11, Dawn of the Kingdom. The cold grip of night began to loosen as the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. Jerusalem, a city weighed down by sorrow and uncertainty, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something miraculous to break through the gloom. Matthew stood among the rough stones near the garden tomb, his heart a tempest of grief and hope. The memories of the last days, the miracles, the teachings, the betrayal, swirled in his mind like a storm, fierce and unrelenting. He had watched the one they called Rabbi endure suffering beyond measure, and now faced the unbearable void left in his absence. Yet whispers traveled like a soft breeze through the city streets. Whispers of an empty tomb, of angels and visions, of a victory over death itself. Women who had been close to Yeshua spoke of seeing him alive, radiant and transformed. Could it be true? Could the impossible have happened? Matthew's thoughts raced back to the moment he had left the tax booth behind, drawn by a call that had seemed impossible to refuse. He recalled the rough hands of fishermen, the faces of the sick and broken, and the fiery words of the rabbi who spoke of a kingdom unlike any other, a kingdom not built on power or gold, but on grace, love, and redemption. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the city's ancient stones, the disciples gathered, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Then, like a dawn that banished all shadows, Yeshua appeared among them, the wounds in his hands and side no longer marks of death, but symbols of triumph. "Peace be with you," he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of eternity and the gentleness of a shepherd's care. In that moment, the heaviness that had burdened Matthew's soul was lifted. The chains of doubt and fear shattered like glass, replaced by a fierce flame of faith and purpose. The kingdom Yeshua had spoken of was not a distant dream, but a living, breathing reality, breaking forth like the dawn after a long night. Matthew felt a new strength surge within him, a call not just to follow, but to lead, to proclaim this message of hope to all who had lost their way. The man who had once been a despised tax collector now stood as a beacon of transformation, a witness to the power of grace that could redeem even the darkest of souls. As the city awoke, so too did a new era. The dawn had come, not just for Matthew, but for all who believed. The kingdom was here, and with it, the promise of a future filled with light, courage, and boundless love. And Matthew, once a man bound by the chains of his past, was ready to walk boldly into that future, carrying the light of the kingdom into every shadowed corner of the world. Chapter 12. The Evangelist's Quill. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the bustling towns and quiet villages Matthew now traveled to share the message he had once been too afraid to embrace fully. The road was long, dusty, and often perilous, yet every step he took was guided by a newfound purpose: to write the story of the one who had transformed his very soul. Gone was the man weighed down by greed and suspicion, the tax collector who once sat isolated at the booths, counting coins without joy or hope. In his place stood an evangelist, wielding not a sword or spear, but a humble quill, a weapon mightier than any blade, capable of piercing the hardest hearts and opening the darkest minds. Matthew's days were consumed by the steady scratch of pen on parchment, his hands stained with ink but steady with determination. Each word was chosen with care, each sentence crafted to breathe life into the memories of Yeshua. The miracles that defied understanding, the parables that illuminated truth, and the sacrifice that shattered the chains of sin. Traveling from town to town, Matthew found himself surrounded by crowds eager for the hope he carried. Children sat wide-eyed at his feet, elders nodded in solemn agreement, and skeptics could not help but pause, caught in the weight of his testimony. But the road was not without its shadows. Opposition grew fierce and relentless. Authorities whispered threats, and old enemies from his past sought to undermine the message he spread. Yet through every trial, Matthew's faith only deepened, tempered by the fires of persecution and the unshakable conviction that this was his calling. In the quiet hours of the night, beneath a canopy of stars, Matthew often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the despised tax booth to the sacred halls of divine revelation, he had been remade, a vessel of light entrusted with a sacred mission. The quill in his hand became more than just a tool. It was a beacon, a sword, a bridge connecting earth to heaven. His writings would travel beyond the cities and villages he walked, reaching into the hearts of countless generations yet to come. And though the path was uncertain and dangers lurked in every shadow, Matthew pressed onward, driven by the promise that the kingdom he now proclaimed was eternal, unshakable, and full of boundless grace. With every word inscribed, every story shared, he carried forward the legacy not of a mere man, but of the Messiah, the light of the world, whose love could transform even the darkest soul. As the dawn of a new era rose on the horizon, Matthew, the evangelist once known as the tax collector, stood ready to write the final chapters of a story that would change the course of history forever. And so ends the journey of Matthew, once a man shunned and scorned, now a pillar of faith and a beacon of hope. His transformation from a despised tax collector to a devoted evangelist reminds us all that no soul is beyond redemption, no past too dark to be washed clean by grace. As the light of his story shines across the ages, may it inspire every heart to seek truth, embrace forgiveness, and walk boldly in the path of the kingdom. Thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this incredible journey through the life and legacy of Matthew, the soul collector turned evangelist. If you have been moved by this story, please consider subscribing to our channel to explore more tales of faith, courage, and redemption. Your support keeps the light alive and helps spread these timeless stories far and wide. Until next time, may your own journey be filled with light and purpose.